When we talk about building virtual worlds, we of course have to start with what is a world? And you can say it's just our boundaries. It's the environment where we go to hunt for what we need and what we want. And that is how I usually start talks about virtual world building, but there is something very special about this morning, about last night, which is we have yet again gone through and we are still going through quite an ordeal, quite an election. And there is another question that we need to ask ourselves or that comes up. And it is why we are going through the exhaustion of political parties. Why are we going through it over and over again? And essentially, we're just trying to introduce competition where there isn't any competition. Most of us have to live in the country where we are born. And when we are in that country, we have to obey by the law of that land. And that is essentially the origin story of wars. It is the origin story of definitely elections. And it is the origin story of the nation-state system that so much influence what each and every one of us ends up being and what we're able to achieve and accomplish. But it is also something that is so scarcity-based in a world where arguably we don't have to think about territory as scarce any longer. Because we have been doing this. We have been crawling into our screens and into a virtuality that is endless. Theoretically, each and every one of us could start our own state. We can send, it's just 4 steps that the UN requires us to do. You send in and you say, okay, I want this plot of land and I want it to be governed this way, but it has to be land that isn't already claimed. Now, all the land on planet Earth is claimed, but the virtual space is endless. So the question then is, can we, as we do every day, view this as the world where we go to hunt for what we need and what we love? And the fact is, because of a word that is hard to spell, hard to pronounce, and that I would love to see a show of hands of how many of you have heard about or have an experience with, this has become very possible. That word is ephemeralization. How many of you are familiar with that term? It's essentially a process that's been going on for millennia, where humans have been able to have increased output with decreased input. So this is the same thing as when people used to use measuring sticks, and then someone invented a rope, and suddenly you could measure even longer distances, but with less material. And today we're able to use lasers to go even further distances, but again, with very ephemeral means. Now, this is what is backing that innovation, where we are turning more and more to our screens because it is within them that we are able to fulfill what we want and need. It is because of ephemeralization we have digital work, that we have the potential of, I think many of you might have considered, at least for a part of your careers, to be digital nomads in one way or another. And we have a bigger and bigger part of what a human desire that can be achieved and accessed through virtuality. Now, why is that important? It is because who you depend on for what you need and love is who has power over you. That's it. If you make a little list, who do you depend on for what you need and love, that is going to be who has power and influence over you. And that has long since been states. To a large extent, the things that we really need, electricity, healthcare, these are things that had a self-evidence due to their very physical constitution. But when we go through the list of what people need and love today, when we look at electricity and we look at the shift from fossil fuels that are so very territorial in nature, in terms of both the pipelines to access them from certain locations to get them to other locations, but also when it comes to the alternative, which is so much more ephemeral. Solar cells, things that essentially are already distributed grids, and that we have to have the technology to access, to reap from wherever we are. And we can go through this list that could do, hours on each thing that humans need and love that have moved towards the ephemeral. We can look at healthcare again as something that I think many of the talks will touch upon. When you're talking about AI doctors and things like that, you're talking about ephemeral options for what used to be territorially bound solutions. And so in this new landscape, we have new overlords that are rising up. We have the equivalent to the most powerful company, arguably, that has been in the world, which used to be the East Indian Company. Today we have instead Amazon, of course. And we have the metaverse and all these very ambitious attempts that in a sort of a very twisted kind of plot takes the endlessness of virtual territories and attempts to make them scarce, attempts to lock us in through the network effect that is so human in that we want to be where other humans are, but that is also just one option as how we can create virtual worlds. We don't have to just replicate the scarcity, which is what many of these so-called neo-feudal lords are attempting to do. And the question is, of course, how states respond to what can be called nothing except a challenge to an incumbent order. And currently, that response is getting more and more aggressive. We see in the EU, the latest legislation is the Digital Markets Act that really tries to limit the reach and the influence of these conglomerates that are dominating the virtual space. We see it with these crazy fines that you might have seen in the news the other day from Russia. We see it with China's big crackdown on tech, where they are making very sure that the muscle, which are technology. To me, that is the best analogy for technology at any point. Technology is muscle for what we want. And so what the Chinese party is doing is they're making sure those muscles are working for them, integrated into that state. But again, this is what you would expect. This is a challenge to the order, and then you're going to see people cracking down on whoever is the newcomer. But it's also very easy right now to be very critical of the overlords of these virtual spaces, because they are throwing away everything that is the bedrock of what we call organized society. Things like the rule of law, the idea that the rules that are in place are something that the people who have to live by those rules in some way should be able to influence. This is what we call the due process for influence. There is nothing like that when it comes to the platforms where many of us spend such a big part of our day. We have, at this present moment, the average hour spent in virtual worlds is 6 hours. 10 hours if you're in South Africa, 4 hours if you're in Japan. But that is like the global range of hours spent. And when we are in these worlds, like I can do the simplest party trick right now if I want to leave a democracy, and all I have to do is go to this computer. And then as soon as I delve into it, I'm no longer in a democracy. And so that makes it very easy to critique what is coming up here. But the state is in no way this angelic entity either. The state and organized society at its core is organized by violence. Behind every single law that we abide by, there is a gun. A loaded gun, whether we feel it pointed at us or not. That is what the police is. That is what essentially how we create and how we enforce rules in physical territories. But as you know, as developers know, that is not how we enforce rules in virtual worlds. Instead, what we use are interfaces. We use code as law by coding the actions that should be possible, and by backing laws, not with violence, but instead in the same way that the laws of physics are backed. And how are the laws of physics backed? Why can't I just levitate and fly out towards you right now? Because it is impossible. And that is the same way that we are able to build interfaces. We make actions impossible. And when we do that, we don't need that gun anymore. And we have the possibility to filter out human nature. Now, if you have ever been in a discussion about politics, you will likely have heard someone say, but that's human nature. Humans will always behave this way. It's human nature. But every time that we are in a virtual world, we are abiding by the rules in that world. That's why people who are very far out on the antisocial spectrum can play video games and just, go about their happy way, complying with whatever rules are laid down in code. And that's a huge opportunity to create the kind of societies that are not as violent. But so much of that potential right now is wasted. And we see it and we feel it in the exhaustion that many of us experience when we are online. Because those interfaces that the new neo-feudal lords to a large extent are creating, well, they are just about, as we know, retention, engagement, just getting us to stay, getting us to be as drained of data, sure, but also our time and, which I personally think is maybe the biggest opportunity cost, our care. Because you have people every day who are opening their phones and they're seeing things that they care about. And all they're asked to do is raise awareness, share something. That is such a minuscule action in proportion to what is theoretically and technically possible in terms of collaboration. And we see those things played out in the most standard example of people doing protein folding together or creating Wikipedia. And those are the go-to examples. But I find the more interesting and just joyous examples in gaming, in the virtual worlds. Just it never makes the mainstream news, but every single world wonder has been created in Minecraft. The way that an interface can make people collaborate together and also collaborate across these borders that we in our physical worlds claim are so defining that they can never be overcome. For example, everything based on appearance, like what a person looks like. All of that we are able to clearly, evidently, to circumvent when we are in our virtual realm. And so the question is, who are you in this? Because you are developers. And I would say that you are not actually in tech anymore. Whether you like it or not, you are in geopolitics. You are at the very center of all of this. It's not something that is discussed on the news yet, but it is going on all the time. This gradual shift from the self-evidence of physicality and physical institutions to what we saw in COVID, how much of societies could actually go virtual. And then we came back because, for one, that's where the point of gravity is in the habit, in everything that is already up and running in a certain way. But we have seen that it's possible even with the tools of today. So where could we go with the tools that are emerging? So when I talk about this with developers, there are two things that tend to come up. And the first is essentially saying, if we don't lock users in, if we don't attempt to just become, as close to our own sort of neo-feudal lords, if we don't do that, we will not get funding from VCs. We will not get the traction that we need. And the more people say that, the more saturated the businesses that are exploitative in nature, that attempt to not serve but use the users. And for every, like the more exhausted people get with how they feel when they are on social media and feel that they are, wasting hours that they didn't want to waste, procrastinating, all of that. The more of that, the bigger the opportunity to create alternatives that actually have the value proposition of value. And so that's the first sort of counter to the cynicism. The second thing that tends to come up is saying that I feel small. I feel timid. There is an intimidation in thinking, okay, am I supposed to think about geopolitics? Am I supposed to think about interfaces as essentially curating populations? And when I hear that, I often think about the people who are not timid. Because who really has the right to design and to command how all of us should be living in the future and right now? Like the idea of any version of democracy is that the governed should be able to influence the governance. So this is not about more people deciding how they think everyone should live. This is about designing interfaces that give people agency. Because that's what we don't have right now. On any of the social platforms, we are not given encouragement and agency to be as powerful as we can be in our lives, in our communities. And those are the interfaces that we need to start sandboxing and experimenting with. And the reason it is so pivotal right now is because we are standing and we are living through arguably one of the biggest shifts ever. And that is the rise of AI and how that cuts to the heart of what defines a society. What defines a society is how value is produced and how value is distributed. So this is like the pyramids. You have slaves that are doing labor, and then that's distributed to whoever that legal order saw as most deserving. You have modernity, when the model was that you have the production of value that's by people, and then some of that value goes back to workers, some goes to the people who own the capital, and some goes into territory state that redistributes some of that value to the rest of the population. But where we are right now is that value has shifted. Who is creating value is not just people. It's people and algorithms. And so how will value then be distributed? Well, this is, another way of looking at robots are taking our jobs kind of thing, which is not the problem if you have a better way to distribute value than going through this model that we had in modernity. But if you just keep going with the system we have right now, then yes, every single one of us is in trouble. And I think we all know that. Which means we really have to come to a point where we are discussing how we want this world to be constituted. But for that, we do not have the interfaces. I have a book coming out in April, which just sort of summarizes different realistic utopias, so-called utopias. And that's a book that people think is written for political scientists. And it definitely is not. Because while this wave of ephemeralization has changed part after part of our human experience, that interface, the interface of a parliament building, the interface of a ballot box, they are the same. This doesn't change. And why? Because innovation, as it currently stands, comes to us on markets. It doesn't come as changes in the legal order. There is nothing incentivizing a country to say, hey, we're going to do this differently now. There are no incentives for that. And so what we have is great ideas from political scientists. We have things like liquid democracy, prediction markets, and no adoption. No adoption. We have even things like fact-checking, which could be made so easy if we would hold politicians to a track record of what they've said and what they've done. But instead, we just keep going with the debates, which is literally an ancient interface, an ancient format. And so we have, again, super cool ideas of that maybe we should divide governance into one level that has to do with global risks, one level that's virtual, where you can team up with the people who have similar ideology that you do, regardless of where you're located in the world. Sort of the way that it has always been with religions, that people opt into and then follow the laws within that religion. And then lastly, very local syndicates. Like this is a theoretical possibility that never was a theoretical possibility before. We used to say in political science that everything after Plato is a footnote. Like Plato and footnotes. And Plato never sent an email. So Plato doesn't know. So we have so much more that we can start working with. But for that, we need interfaces. And so it brings us back to Buckminster Fuller's claim that if you want something to change, you can't just fight it. You can build what makes what was obsolete. And that's what people like you can do. You can start experimenting with interfaces like this. And the stakes here are very high. Also, in that when we enter virtuality, we have the chance to not drain the planet of its resources. When you're talking about the idea of infinite growth on a planet with finite resources, a lot of economists will say that's just impossible and people need to wake up to that is impossible. I don't agree. I think it's very possible within a virtual context. Because what we do in our lives is we try to get emotions. That's what we're after. Some people want to get, the feeling of belonging. Some want to get thrills. Some want to feel secure. Whatever feeling you want, it has been very costly for the planet. But if we are able to get more and more of those feelings virtually, that is not as costly for the planet. And there is another old philosopher, Seneca, who used to say that everything or the only thing a person needs is a garden and a library. And that's not true, because you also need social approval for that is enough. And that's what we don't have right now for people who, for example, want to spend most of their lives gaming. We will still look down on that to such a large extent, even though I will venture that is the way out of so much of our ecological crisis. That is excellent film, a documentary that is up right now on Netflix about a person who went to really hunt for the emotions that he wanted in a virtual world because he was physically constrained. But it is, I think, the clearest way to make what I'm talking about here like really real. So I would really recommend seeing that. When I reach this point of talking about all the things we could be doing with interfaces but aren't currently tapping, people want to know, who is doing this, who is actually like devoting themselves to virtual nations. And this slide looks different every time, because right now we're at this place, sort of with everything we use today, every service we use today. There were a lot of attempts at services before that came and they didn't stick. Some of these tend to become crypto scams at some point. It's a very strange subculture right now, virtual worlds. But the core is that the technology has changed and we just haven't caught up to it. Not in terms of our narratives, not in terms of how we think of ourselves. And so I would love to pose to each and every one of you 2 questions. And the first one is thinking about the interfaces that have filtered out who you are. You are going to be different depending on what the interfaces make you. And so you probably by now have a long history of certain interfaces that made you furious and angry and frustrated, and others that made you more sociable, some interfaces that incentivized you towards caring about what, your life looked like, others that made you care more about being very accurate. Like, what have these interfaces filtered out in you? And how would you like to be filtered out? Because what you will be doing, whether or not you're working on a very escapist app or building a collaborative software for teams of one kind or another, you are not just building an interface, you're building people. You're building ultimately populations. And so I will leave you with this classical, very, for most people, abstract quote, which is that the most common way to lose power is to think that you don't have any. But for most people, that is an abstraction. For you, it's very, very concrete. You have the skills to build interfaces that allow people to have agency and control their lives. And we have never talked or looked at ourselves like that. We've been the tech field. But at this point, we are the core of what global governance is becoming, what geopolitics is becoming. And so as you are looking at the election result this morning, think about who you are in relation to that. What services can be accessed and therefore also given in a virtual world where people don't have to be stuck, where they happen to be born, where the most definitive defining thing about you doesn't have to be your passport. All of it technically possible, but we're not there yet in terms of narrative. And where we go narratively, that depends on our conversations at places like this conference. I will leave it there. If you want to check out the utopias, because I think they can be very inspirational in terms of what people have thought would make a good world, then that's a QR code to get you that. And I will be around for the coming days. I would love to talk to people who are interested in essentially doing something with their power. And I will leave it there. I hope you have lovely days here.